Welcome everybody. It's Population Day, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Scientists Warning Europe. I'm Ed Gemmell, I'm the Managing Director of Scientists Warning Europe, and I'm very pleased to see here quite a number of my colleagues, both from the core organisational team and a number of our eminent scientist colleagues as well. This is Population Day, and the World Scientists' Warnings to Humanity have not shrunk away from the issue of population, as have really many other organisations that deal with climate change or biodiversity loss in the world. And if you're aware of the three scientists' warnings, you'll already know the things that I'm about to remind you. But in 1992, when the Union of Concerned Scientists organised and issued the first World Scientists' Warning to Humanity, signed by 1,700 scientists, they told us that human beings were on a collision course with the natural world. And they picked out population and were very clear about it. The Earth is finite. Its ability to absorb wastes and destructive effluent is finite. Its ability to provide food and energy is finite. Its ability to provide for growing numbers of people is finite, and we are fast approaching many of the Earth's limits. Pressures resulting from unrestrained population growth but demands on the natural world that can overwhelm any efforts to achieve a sustainable future. If we're to halt the destruction of our environment, we must accept limits to that growth. A World Bank estimate indicates that the world population will not stabilize at less than 12.4 billion, while the United Nations concludes that the eventual total could reach 14 billion. The context in which those scientists were issuing their warning was in 1992, a population of 5.5 billion, which, as I'm sure we'll hear multiply today, is now at 7.9 billion, only 28 years later. And Earth Overshoot Day, the day when we've used up in our demand for natural resources, all of the Earth's natural resources to the point where it can't replenish itself. Already in 1992, that was on the 11th of October. And now it's calculated as being this year on the 29th of July. The World Scientists' Warning to Humanity, a second notice in 2017, warned us that we were putting humanity's place on the planet at risk by failing to adequately limit population growth. And in the steps needed to stop the problems of climate and biodiversity loss, the scientists noted estimating a scientifically defensible, sustainable human population size for the long term, while rallying nations and leaders to support that vital goal. And that is the question we've put to our speakers today, to come to the point of what is a scientifically sustainable population for the planet, why and how and when to get there, and then to look at whether we should be having a sustainable development goal for the United Nations based around population, and if so, what should that be? The World Scientists' Warning of a Climate Emergency in 2019, and one of our speakers, Professor Phoebe Barnard, was an author of that, said that the scientists have a moral obligation to clearly warn humanity of any catastrophic threat and tell it like it is, which is what we're asking our eminent speakers to say today. And they said that economic and population growth are among the most important drivers of increasing CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion. And we need bold and drastic transformations regarding economic and population policies. Now, Scientists' Warning didn't only talk about population, but it is an essential and important part of all of the warnings. So now, with that in mind, and knowing that we're not going to shy away from this difficult issue, we'd like to ask Professor Bill Rees to now talk with the lead speech for us today. Now, Bill Rees is a population ecologist, ecological economist, and is known as the father of global ecological accounting. He's Professor Emeritus and former Director of the University of British Columbia's School of Community and Regional Planning, and is a founding member and former President of the Canadian Society for Ecological Economics. Bill, we're delighted you're here. Thank you so much. And now I hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning and afternoon to everyone who's joined us today. I'd like to make an opening comment before I get into the main thrust here. And that is that the various projections you hear of population growth going up to 11 or 14 billion are calculated in a complete vacuum. In other words, they are based entirely on demographic data without any contextual information feeding in. So they don't contain any of the data that I'll be talking about today. And I personally believe we won't achieve anything like those population numbers. At any rate, as you can see from my title, I'm looking at the concept of overshoot, the population consumption conundrum. Overshoot's a very complex idea, but hardly yet recognized in the mainstream. It means that the human enterprise, that's to say the human population and all of our economic activities, are simply using the planet faster than it can regenerate and overloading the natural waste capacities of the system. So we are literally, quite literally, consuming and polluting the biophysical basis of our own existence. And I submit that this is the definition of biophysical unsustainability. So overshoot is a meta problem. All other so-called environmental problems or issues are mere symptoms. So we are changing the oceans, acidifying fresh waters, overfishing the seas, degrading landscapes, etc. Climate change is a mere symptom. It's not the greatest existential threat facing humankind, merely a symptom of the greatest existential threat, which is, I would submit, overshoot. So overshoot, really we have to come to grips with it. It's the result of too many people consuming too much energy and material resources. Fixing climate change will not fix overshoot. In fact, everything that is being done today to address climate change will exacerbate the basic problem. So if you think of wind and solar power and electric vehicles, all of these high investment technologies will actually produce more fossil fuel and simply allow the current situation, the status quo of overshoot to continue. And hence addressing climate change in a vacuum exacerbates the basic problem. Fixing overshoot, on the other hand, would reverse climate change as well as address all of the other problems that we're talking about. It's really important to understand the origins of overshoot. And there's dozens, but the two main groups I'm concerned about are fundamental human nature. Human beings are an evolved species. We've evolved as survival engines. And we have two characteristics which we share with all other species: the capacity to expand to fill all accessible habitats. And of course, you recognize that humans have the widest geographic range of any species on the planet, and we will use all available resources. And in the case of humans, availability is constantly being upgraded by technology. So we're simply getting better at doing the things that all other species also are predisposed to doing. But the problem is here that we are predisposed to being unsustainable by nature, and we're getting better at it. The second component of this is nurture, rather. So nature and nurture are working together here. The problem is that human beings are unique in that we socially construct what we perceive to be reality. We make it up as we go along. In other words, we socially conceptual lenses, political ideologies, religious doctrines, economic paradigms, scientific models, cultural narratives are all social constructs, but they become the lenses through which we view the world. And the problem is that we live out of our constructs as if they were real. And the problem here is that the constructed myth of infinite growth through technology is the major construct running the planet today. It's a cultural narrative embodied in neoliberal economics, which reinforces our innate propensity to expand. And here are two statements from economists that emphasize this. There are no limits to the carrying capacity of the earth that are likely to bind at any time in the foreseeable future. Larry Summers, then the director of economics at the World Bank, subsequently president of Harvard University. Julian Simon, we have in our hands now the technology to feed, clothe, and supply energy to an ever-growing population for the next 7 billion years. Well, Simon was a professor of management studies at the University of Maryland. So these are not flaky people, very influential in terms of creating the social vision or constructs from which we operate. So it's a very bad model of reality. The constructed narrative of modern techno-industrial society contains no useful information whatsoever about the ecological or social systems with which the economy interacts in the real world. Very similar, by the way, to the population projection models, no context. And the problem is that if you have a model that doesn't contain useful information, you cannot regulate your interaction with any aspect of reality that your model does not contain. This is a variation of what's called the law of requisite variety. Any controlling system must contain an equivalent amount of diversity as the system that it's attempting to control, or it simply cannot maintain control over that system. So here we are trying to fly planet Earth in this incredible complexity with a model that is so simplistic that it's almost laughable. So here's the basic economic model that appears in most standard economic textbooks. The environment, the ecosphere, doesn't even appear. The economy is perceived as a self-perpetuating circular flow of exchange value between businesses and households, a counter current of money that maintains itself and self-aggrandizes with each round of the circle. The reality is that that whole circular flow is embedded within the ecosphere. And of course, it has to draw on the ecosphere for available energy and matter. And all of that, 100% of the material extracted from the ecosphere by economic activity is returned to the ecosphere in degraded and dissipated form, i.e. high entropy waste. Even the final products eventually emerge back into the system in the form of waste. So what we see is that the economy is in fact, as long as population and economic throughput are growing beyond carrying capacity, then the economy is acting as a malicious parasite. A parasite is one that an organism that gains its vitality at the expense of the vitality of the host. And that's exactly what the symptoms of overshoot show, the declining vitality of the ecosphere as a result of the parasitic relationship between the human enterprise at the present time and the ecosphere. It needn't be that way, but that's the way it is. Well, we need to understand this in terms of the total impact of humankind, and that's why I developed with my graduate students this notion of the ecological footprint. At present, humans are using the equivalent of 20.9 billion hectares of productive land and water, but there's only about 12 point a little bit billion hectares on the planet. So we're in overshoot by about 73%. Even school children will ask, well, how can you be using a bigger planet than you've got? And the answer is that we're drawing down accumulated natural capital. So soils, fish stocks, forests have taken hundreds or even millions of years to accumulate in nature. We can consume, and as Ed has already mentioned, by July of the 29th of this year, we will have used up all of the current productivity of the planet. And after that, we will be drawing down reserves that have accumulated over time. And you can continue to grow by eating your reserves for a period until, of course, you wind up in a state of bankruptcy. So further growth of population and consumption can occur only, and I emphasize only, at the expense of the integrity of the ecological systems that sustain us and the loss of life support functions. We are compromising future well-being. And if you look carefully at ecological footprint analytics, we can actually attribute this to two things, of course, consumption on the one hand and population. So here are graphics that show the population, biocapacity, and eco footprints of high-income countries and middle-income countries from 1960 forward. And what we see is that in each case, the total increase in the footprint has indeed increased in each of these cases, but it's increased much more rapidly in the upper middle income countries than in the high income countries. The population increase in the middle income countries is 120%, only 35% in the high income countries. So the majority of this vast increase in the footprint contributed by upper middle income countries is coming from population growth. There's a very large increase, of course, in the rich countries, but most of it is also attributable to population growth. And the same thing holds true for lower middle income and low income countries. So in the lower middle income category, the total increase in footprint has been 2.96, almost 3 billion gigahectares, a 329% increase, but most of that is attributable to a population increase of 206%. The footprint per capita has only increased by 40%. When you get to the low income countries, there's been no increase whatsoever in the main average footprint. In other words, material standards have not changed for the poorest of the poor, but there has been a substantial increase in the total footprint contribution, entirely in this case attributable to population growth. Now, what these data show is that population growth is now the larger of the two components, consumption and population, contributing to the growth of the human footprint. It by no means excuses the egregious disparity in levels of income and consumption between the richest and the poorest. So relatively few people contributed a very large increase in footprint in the high income countries, most of it attributable to population growth, but that's because each person added to a high income country is 10 or 15 people in a very low income country. So we have two huge problems: egregious inequality. Most of the carrying capacity of the planet is actually taken up by the high income countries, but the current driver of the increase in the human footprint on the whole is population growth, particularly in middle and lower middle income countries. In the case of these countries, both income and population are increasing, and that's the double whammy that impacts the human footprint. So we have a real problem here, and I see this as a population ecologist. As matters stand, the expansion of the human enterprise resembles what I call the plague phase of a one-off boom-bust population cycle. So again, I will insist that human beings are really not that much different from other species in their population dynamics. And what we see, and this is a standard diagram from a standard textbook, that any species which is exposed to an environment exceptionally rich in resources, or if the climate change happens to produce a great deal of food for a species, then it will go into a boom phase, an exponential phase of growth. And that's because every species, humans included, are capable of exponential population growth when the negative feedbacks are removed. However, that explosive growth is interrupted when the nutrients are depleted, or when the environment becomes over polluted, or when predators see this as obviously a booming population is a great target for any predators. So eventually a bust phase occurs and the population is dropped back to fluctuating in the vicinity of its carrying capacity. Now look at the shape of that typical boom curve. And here we see the human population growth curve over the last 10,000 years. And you can see two things from this graph I think are extremely important to take. And that is, we could actually extend the graph for 250 or 300,000 years, so that the explosion of human numbers is an exceedingly recent phenomenon. And it's almost entirely attributable to the extensive use of fossil fuels beginning in the 19th century. Fossil fuels enable us to remove all of the negative feedbacks holding the human population in check. So fossil fuels provided us with abundant food and all the other resources needed to sustain and grow the human population. Surely other factors were involved: better medicine, healthcare, public sanitation, and so on. But without the fossil fuel providing the resources, that wouldn't have mattered. You need the resources to sustain that population explosion. So here we see the explosion in just the last 200 years. The problem is that only 10 generations of people have experienced sufficient growth or technological change in their lifetimes to notice it. So what these last few generations take to be the norm is the single most anomalous period in human history. We are in a period of anomaly, not normalcy. And so when people talk about the return to normalcy after the pandemic, it's really returning to the least normal period in human history, and it's a catastrophic one in terms of the long-term survival of civilization. We can look at cities in this perspective. Look at these projections for some of our large cities. Right now, Tokyo, one city, has the population of Canada, but is scheduled to go, it's actually going to drop a bit. But look at some of these other cities slated to go up to 88 million people. Again, these projections are simply that in a vacuum, using population data in the absence of any of the other information we've been talking about. So we see a situation in which huge numbers of people are going to be exposed to rising sea levels. And a recent study says there will be 1 billion people displaced by sea level rise and other elements of global change, desertification, food supply shortages, and so on, by mid-century. In addition, cities are largely fossil energy dependent. Every one of them is provisioned daily by vast shipments, mostly by diesel truck, aircraft, ship. And we will not be able to sustain those deliveries in the absence of a suitable substitute for fossil fuels. And we do not have that. That's a whole other discussion. But wind, solar, hydrogen, and so on are not going to be able to replace, in any quantitative sense, fossil fuel in the time that we have available. So by mid to late century, we're going to be unable to provision large cities and megacities. Populations will have to be redistributed or collapse. So these are stunning data, but people just forget the power of exponential growth. So what we refuse to acknowledge is that the only way to fix overshoot is through significant reductions, up to 50% globally, perhaps 80% in rich countries, in energy and material throughput. Those are horrific numbers, but they're actually manageable. We could talk about that. However, we're not doing it. To act consistently with our best science would require a planned economic and population contraction to the 1 or 2 billion people who could live more equitably within the means of nature. So here's the curve that really needs flattening. The red curve is humankind's current circumstance. We're in a phase of exponential growth. We're well into overshoot, beyond the carrying capacity of the planet. We will fall. It is going to come down. But we have a choice. We can either collapse, or we can track the dotted red line as we come back toward carrying capacity. We will not be able to achieve the green line because the extensive destruction of the planet by the current levels even of consumption have reduced global carrying capacity, but we should be able to track the dotted red line and thereby save civilization or some remnants thereof. So the choice before us is simple. In coming years, the human enterprise will contract. There's no conceivable way in which you can maintain that upward thrust that we saw a few slides back. As an intelligent, plan-capable species, we can theoretically choose between business as usual, which means risking a chaotic implosion imposed by nature, followed by geopolitical turmoil and resource wars. And by the way, that's the tack we're on, including all of the solutions that are being proposed for climate change. They are designed to maintain the status quo, technology, or rather growth in technology just through alternative means. Or we can take the course of a well-planned, orderly, cooperative descent toward a socially just sustainability for all. That option is not even on the table. Despite decades of hardening evidence, and Ed mentioned all of these in the scientists' warning, rising rhetoric on the risks of global climate change, no agency, no international government, no corporate leader anywhere has begun to advocate in public, let alone implement the kind of policy responses that are called forth by our best sciences today. So even knowing history, we seem doomed to repeat it. And by the way, at another slide, I eliminated for time purposes. But if you look at the 60-year record we have of carbon dioxide, it's an exponential increase in carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. And in that half-century period, we've had something like 34 climate conferences, 6 major climate agreements to reverse those trends, and they haven't even caused a blimp, a dimple in the rising curve of carbon dioxide emissions. So even when we agree to do something, we've been unable to reverse the most basic drivers, in this case, of one symptom, climate change. Only a small fraction of the population is consistently capable of applying the most basic rules of evidence to emotionally derived or emotionally loaded information. So when we talk about reducing changing our lifestyles, people feel threatened. And once we feel threatened, our emotions kick in, a form of denial kicks in. We simply cannot face the reality that would cause significant pain, or at least perceived pain, in the changes necessary. And so the rise and fall of cultures has always been primarily determined by the tides of human passion, not by the ebb and flow of reason. Another quote, if you're waiting for ecological crisis to persuade human beings to change their troubled relationship with nature, you'll be waiting a long, long time. So that's the message of Overshoot. It's real, it's the mega problem, it's the source of all the other difficulties that we think of as environmental problems. We can solve none of them unless we face the reality of Overshoot. And as a culture, globally or nationally at the present time, we show very little indication of willingness to admit to the nature of the problem, let alone to the kinds of solutions that would be necessary to solve it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. So that's great. And we will be certainly looking forward to hearing your answers to our two key questions as we move forward. I'd now like to welcome Professor Phoebe Barnard. And Phoebe Barnard is a revered colleague on Scientists Warning Europe and a board member. Phoebe is a full professor at the University of Washington and has spent much of her career working in the subcontinent of Africa. Phoebe, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ed, and thank you, Bill, for a bracing talk. I love and hate the way that Bill phrased this for us. Horrific, but manageable. I hate it because we all know that it is horrific. I love it because I know that it is manageable, but the hill is really steep. How are we going to climb it? We have multiple dimensions of change that need to happen all at once in a vanishingly short time. I'm also a population ecologist by training and an evolutionary behavioral ecologist, but for many years I've been working in conservation biology, global change ecology, and science and public policy, mainly, as Ed mentioned, in Southern and Eastern Africa. And so I feel these things very deeply, and I wanted not to take away from the impact of what Bill says. We have to absorb and really internalize this message in everything we do. Now, one of the good things that having nearly 8 billion people on the planet it involves is that there's a large gene pool of smart people that can work on multiple issues at once. We are at the biggest crossroads that any of us have ever known in our lifetimes. How will we navigate from this point in time forward? As Bill made very clear, we have a choice. We can choose the path that we're on of gormless denial and failure to grab evidence and reality and embrace positive change, or we can learn from the history of climate change, pandemics, societal economic instability, and the collapse of governments, and indeed civilizations. And we can choose to do it differently, but the tasks are daunting. Ed mentioned that the scientists' warning of a climate emergency paper had identified 6 areas, and I'd just like to briefly touch on that, if I may. Ed, I'm just going to share my screen for a second. And I wanted to remind those of you who have read any of these papers, not only the bioscience paper in 2019 and 2020, online and in print, but also short follow-up papers in Bioscience and Scientific American, where we looked at essentially, in the first case, the importance of carbon sinks, forests, and other ecosystems in really taking us forward into the future, and how we need to internalize these in our public policy, planning, and management. But also in the Scientific American paper, summarizing what had been done in 2020, a year in which we should have expected the planet to have a reprieve, but fundamentally did not. Energy conservation and transitions, short-term atmospheric pollutants. I'm going to bring up a graphic here, including methane and carbon soot and so on, nature restoration and conservation, food systems, not only reform of agriculture to a significantly more regenerative agriculture, but also significant shifts in people's diets to draw down the amount of animal protein that we rely on, which is one of the most significant drivers of ecosystem loss. Of course, population stabilization, that's why we're here, through very supportive but also significant changes in public policy, education, economic opportunity, but not just that. That may not be enough on its own, and nobody wants coercive policies. So we have to focus very much on this issue. And then finally, shift and reform of economic goals away from hyperconsumption and private profit, much more towards human and planetary health and well-being, as we have known for many decades, really, now that we've got to get to. I was on the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Board and EXCO and Scenarios Working Group about 15 years ago, 16 years ago, and it's been a really transformative issue for me in understanding not only the complexity of the challenges that we face, but also the power of collaborative thinking and problem solving and multidisciplinarity and engagement with public policymakers, planners, community members, and so on to achieve change. So I want to just touch on a few points. One, a lot of people say that population stabilization is a taboo topic. It's touchy. It's had this very real history of apparent and sometimes real racism, misogyny, condescension, cultural arrogance. Most of that is completely true. And yet, nonetheless, that does not give us a free pass to stop talking about it. We cannot kick the can down the road any further. People have been saying that it's not population, it's consumption. Bill has shown very clearly it is both, and we cannot delay any longer talking about both. And with 8 billion people nearly, we've got enough smart minds to figure out how to talk about them both. And I'll mention some interesting things that we're doing in a minute. But every baby born today commits us to the use of resources. The net growth of population is something that we cannot kick down the road. So I do believe we're out of time. And, you know, working in national development and environmental planning in Namibia and South Africa, particularly for 34 years of my working life so far, I realize how quickly development gains can be eroded nationally, locally, globally by population, exponential population growth. A number of people have been talking about the importance of wisdom in the work that we do. Homo sapiens is named this for our supposed smarts. We can be great at logic. We can also be great at illogic, but we fail to apply wisdom that we should learn from our forefathers and mothers, particularly taking this into the new generation. So I would like to see wisdom, ethics, and knowledge be an explicit focus of the teaching that we do, both as parents, if we are parents, and in our schools, in our governance training and everything. Science and sociology show clearly the benefits of having small, well-planned families that we can afford. This isn't just about science. This is about ethics, about faith communities, about artistry, about poetry. All of the endeavors of human society need to be brought to bear on this issue. As an ecologist, I know too well that a fragmented state of our planet cannot support life at this intensity. And we are also moving into rapid and really intense climate change that is putting people on the move. I used to work on climate migration of other species, birds in Africa and elsewhere, and now I'm working on climate in-migration preparedness of humanity. Big, big issue that will challenge everything that we think we know in our relatively stable, prosperous, and predictable communities. I guess I want to say really just one or two more things. One is that we often speak quite superficially about inequity on our planet. Yes, we have rich and hyper-consumptive countries, and those countries need to get to grips with that. But within countries, both in the developed and supposedly developing world, there is great inequity, and we need to acknowledge it. There are as rich, obscenely rich people in South Africa, Nigeria, Chile, other countries as we have anywhere, almost, than perhaps the US. And we need to acknowledge those dynamics and how they affect what we do in our population policies. However, there's a big change in public sentiment in many countries. Let's harness that. We need to invest both in economic opportunities and educational opportunities, yes. May not be enough, but it's a very, very important place to start. And focusing on health and well-being, both of humans and the planet, and quality of life rather than private profit. History, if we have one down the road, will remember us very badly in the Western world for such an outrageous economic system. And then finally, I want to introduce you, I'll share my screen just for a second again, to Girl Planet Earth, which is a really nice, let's see, how can I take this forward? Sorry. Girl Planet Earth, I'm maybe not able to share the screen. I'll try once more. Girlplanet.earth is a new dialogue of women and teenage girls from around the world talking about population, consumption, planetary boundaries, nature, culture, sexual politics, faith communities, and restrictions or guidance on these issues. And it's an important and powerful set of voices that have not been heard. You know, here we are in this panel, a bunch of white people from the North mainly, talking about issues, but there are powerful and really relevant voices. I would urge you to go to this site being soft launched today and check it out. There are such resonant insights and challenges that girls and women around the world are having. And of course, it's not just about girls and women, it's about every young person on this planet. I'd like to see fewer graybeards up here, myself included, not that I happily have a beard, but certainly I want to see more voices amplified for young women, and that's what this community and this website tries to do. So I'll leave it there, but thank you, Bill, and I'm looking forward to Chris Tucker's talk and Jane O'Sullivan's talk too. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you so much, Phoebe, and you're absolutely right. We can't see any greybeard in sight on your screen, so that's certainly not a worry for you. I just wanted to at this point, I think it's worth looking at the fact that there are the two issues, and I've seen it coming up in some of the comments, as there is a big difference, of course, between population growth or children being born in the rich West and those being born in other parts of the world. And I hope that the speakers will address that later on. I just a request I could to all those of you who are asking questions. It's great to put in comments and we like them, and please debate them amongst yourselves. If you really want a question answered, can you phrase it as a question? Otherwise, you've got me and the speakers going through trying to work out what's a question and needs answering. So if you have a question, then please do put it in. And just to put him on warning for later on, as I can see another one of our board members, Professor Chris Rhodes here, as we go into the debate on the main issues, particularly Chris, if you would like to come in and say something on the two main questions, please feel free. It would be interesting to hear your perspective once we go into that. Okay, so thank you so much, Phoebe. That's absolutely wonderful. And good luck with the new venture as well that you shared with us. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Chris Tucker, who is the chairman of the American Geographical Society. Chris, thank you so much for being with us. Welcome, and over to you.
Thanks for having me. I'll share my screen real fast. Oops. I think I failed to share. Give me a second. All right, I think I'm up. So thank you very much for having me here today. It's very important questions. What is sustainable population? Why, when, and what should we do about it? Thanks to Scientists Warning Europe for holding this event, Ed Gemmel and your team for organizing, Phoebe Barnard for getting me invited, and the opportunity to share a stage with Professor Rees and Dr. O'Sullivan is a real honor. Thank you very much. Thanks for all of you for taking time today out of your Sunday to grapple with this important set of issues. So I'd like to start with Earth Day 1970. Earth Day 1970, 51 years ago, population was top of mind. Partially it was top of mind because people recognized that from the 1.6 billion humans on the earth around 1900, they had already faced the doubling, and they recognized the slope of the curve. So it was, again, front of mind and centered in the Earth Day discussions. 50 years later, just last year, not a peep. You barely heard anything in the press. I searched, it just was not central to the discussions of Earth Day at all, even though we had hit 7.7, possibly even 7.8 by that time. The one notable exception months earlier was the World Scientists Warning of Climate Emergency by the Scientists Warning Organization in Bioscience. And that's what really kind of caught my eye. Honestly, in the earlier incarnation of Scientists Warning, I had missed those. It was not my field of study. It was not my area of interest at the time. But to see population brought front and center to the discussions of the climate, I thought was a brave and powerful thing to do. But to reflect on my own personal kind of story here, it was 50 years ago that we had Earth Day, 51, but it was 25 years ago, 26, when as a student, I attended the inaugural lecture of Columbia University's Earth Institute. And Joel Cohen, as the inaugural lecturer, spoke on his new book, How Many People Can the Earth Support? And since that time, quarter century ago, I always viewed that as the most important question that all of us should be asking ourselves when we get up in the morning, when we're talking with our friends and family and our colleagues. However, he didn't really have an answer that kind of dialed in on a specific number or giving me personally a way that I could be comfortable grappling with it. And it took a long time, and bulk of my career, which strayed into the field of geography for me to come up with my own answer. Since I didn't bury the lead at all, my number's at 3 billion. We'll get to that later. But when you talk about what is the carrying capacity of the planet, I think it's important for us to understand what is the planet. And part of my dissatisfaction with kind of earlier discussions and debates around the carrying capacity of the planet was kind of a lack of geographic grounding. And as the chairman of the American Geographical Society, I would be remiss to not use some maps to kind of lay out my argument. So first, I talk about ecoregions. The world is broken up into a finite number of specific ecoregions, specific ecological places on our planet that each have distinct names. And to give you a little video tour real fast, right? You know, each one of these places is a unique set of flora and fauna, unique terrain and climate, singular flows of water. And you can't think of these places as, you know, just general land. And if we, you know, inhabit a certain number of hectares, you know, it'll be okay. And if we inhabit another number, it won't be okay. It really is about how we inhabit and potentially delete and burden these ecoregions. But it's not just terrestrial ecoregions. Turns out we also have some marine ecoregions that have been delineated through the same biogeographical methodology. And, you know, as we all know, our oceans are very important to life on our planet, and it's the interaction of these marine and terrestrial ecoregions that matter to us. So in my efforts, you know, having been active in the geography and geospatial science and technology community for so long, I just wanted to understand how we have burdened these unique ecological places on our planet. And if you take those numbers Professor Rees kind of put out and array them spatially with just a handful of layers, roads, major highways that bisect and transect our ecological regions. You know, the intensively cultivated agricultural zones, which are those big black smudges, the toxic sites, which are in purple, the yellow, yellow and orange, which is ocean dead zones. From excess agricultural and urban effluent. And red are the areas where we have intensely populated areas, which, as we all know, we have a tendency to pave a lot of the places where we live, and annihilating, deleting, or burdening the ecological regions that are underfoot. And, you know, got to have a spinning globe. And this is important because, you know, we also have managed to throw enormous patches of garbage into our oceans in the yellow. And this is just a handful of layers when you look at what is the human footprint on our planet at this stage of the game. So, you know, a lot of us here, we're talking about climate change, therefore we're talking about our carbon footprint. And indeed, our carbon footprint matters. I would argue that our carbon footprint is twice as bad as you think, but only 1/10 of the problem. And I think this is something that Professor Rees really talked about. I'm not going to go into each of these. I've got a whole book on it if you feel like reading it. We all have our lists and way of breaking down kind of the human footprint on our planet, but it is massive and continuously growing with the growing population. So to today's topic, how do you calculate your maximum carrying capacity? This is chapter 8 in my book, if you feel like digging in on a whole lot of words. But it's important to recognize that this isn't a new question, and many people have dealt with it in very interesting and useful ways. In many ways, I'd say that my own thinking on this is just friendly amendments on the shoulders of giants, as we like to say. But to start, right, back in 1970, Barry Commoner, Paul Ehrlich, and John Holdren, if you remember, John Holdren was Barack Obama's science advisor, came up with the IPAT, population times affluence times technology is kind of our footprint. And they really focused on energy and what was possible with the energy resources we had. And they came up with a number. Well, we can talk about that number later. We also have the planetary boundaries thesis. Johan Rockström from the Stockholm Resilience Center and Will Steffen from Australian National University. They came up with a set of boundaries that if we surpass those boundaries, we will undermine our planet's ability to support us as a species. Ecological footprint thesis, Professor Rees indeed is the creator of the ecological footprint concept, and the work of Matthis Wackernagel, one of his students, has done an amazing job of accounting at a national level which countries are ecological debtors and which ones are ecological creditors, mostly through the lens of carbon accounting, which I think, as we've discussed, carbon footprint is only one small piece of our larger footprint. So I would argue that in many cases, our footprint is even more dire than what comes out in those calculations. But what I think is critical about it is it brought in that realm of geography, where we can understand what parts of the planet are being burdened more than others and which are contributing to the net burden of our planet more than others. Geographically explicit biocapacity thesis. If you Google this, you'll find it nowhere on the web. I had to contort lots of words to try to fairly represent the work of Professor Paul Sutton at University of Denver, who's a population geographer, sustainability scientist, and an ecological economist. But that work really used the innovations of satellite remote sensing. We all know about Landsat satellites and the Sentinel satellites that the EU has put up, and our ability to understand at a square kilometer level where humanity is exerting its footprint has really provided, I think, some additional tools to that tool set for understanding ecological footprint that humanity has had. And then what I'd call my own Planet of 3 billion thesis, which I'll skip over, other than to say my number that I come to is built upon all these methodologies, and it is an optimistic number of 3 billion that we can get to later, only because I'm a technological optimist. But key here is not just the number that our planet can support, it is the fertility rate that we should seek. If we have indeed already exceeded our planet's ecological carrying capacity, if indeed we have been accumulating ecological debt at a nightmarish pace since we passed that threshold in the mid-20th century, and we could argue when we pass that threshold later in the discussion, then what is the total fertility rate that we need to seek? Because we actually need to bring that curve down. It is not enough to achieve zero population growth. That would be a total fertility rate of 2.1. I would argue that we long ago exceeded our planet's carrying capacity, and we need to actually bring that curve down, not only so that we can live within our planet's carrying capacity, but so that we can rewild and invest back in nature to frankly help recover what is quickly becoming a more abundant planet. So my call is for 1.5 TFR by 2030. And some people may say, Chris, that's ridiculous. How could we ever do it? But you've seen in Professor Reese's diagrams, fertility has actually declined steadily over the 20th century. I would say not fast enough, but we are currently at 2.45. So if you think about it, in many ways, that's kind of 2 to 3 children per woman. And all I'm recommending is 1 to 2 children per woman on average. But we're talking about shifting a norm. And this is something I wrote about in Journal of Population and Sustainability. Thank you to Dave Samways for providing great editorial work on that. But how do you go about doing that? Just to point out that I'm not solely focused on population. In my book, I have a whole chapter around a cookbook for global leaders and global citizens of all the many things that we could and should do to help bring our population, our planet in line with each other. But I do like to call out that women and girls play a unique role in our ability to get to a better place as a species and a planet. It just so turns out that every geography where women are empowered, women are educated, women are integrated into the workforce, and where women have access to family planning technologies, you witness a total fertility rate that is either break even, right, replacement value, or below replacement value. And what I would argue is that investment in women and girls' well-being, in their education, in their empowerment, in their skills for engaging in the workforce, and again, access to family planning technologies is key if we're going to bend the population curve. One comment, there was an article in Lancet by the IMHE research group from University of Washington last summer, and their new modeling was that they believe population will peak at 9.7 billion in 2064, which horrifies me because I believe we exceeded our Earth's carrying capacity at 3 billion some 75 years ago. However, if you look at that article, one of the nice things about it is the basis of that estimate was to say that investment in women's education and access to family planning is ahead of schedule, if you will. More of it has happened than in a lot of the demographic models that are out there. So they believe that we will bend that curve earlier than many of these other projections. To which, I had a question back to the research lead on that paper asking, how much more investment in women and girls around the world would be required to bend the curve early, 1.5 TFR by 2030, to which the response was, that's not our research question, which I thought was not cool. But anyways, investment in women and girls is key to getting there. And by doing that, I think we need to kind of stop focusing on discussions of population control and population policy and potential coercive measures, and think about ethical, just, and empowering strategies toward women and girls. I think we'll all be shocked and amazed by what good it will do for our planet. I too want to call out girlplanet.earth, great work that Phoebe has been involved in. I've got to witness great work by an amazing team of women and some men. It turns out men have a role just as important or more important than women. It turns out men are at least, if not more than half of the problem. We should all, men and women, be focused on the well-being of women and girls, and we need to listen to their voices. So that's why I'm kind of inspired by this effort. There's many voices. I've already I woke up to this and read a number of the stories, and it made me think about things in ways that I had not before. So that's me. All of you have an opportunity to save our planet. If you're beyond childbearing years, you may be a grandparent. Everybody needs to understand that our reproductive behavior is a choice. It is something that we have the most control over, probably, of anything in our lives, and that every additional child, one child, has more ecological impact than going vegan, which you should do also. But I think we need to appreciate that this is something that is in our control if we think about it the right way. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. We'll certainly be coming back to some of the things you pointed out there. That was great. And just for everybody here, we are, as a group, scientists warning. So we are definitely up for scientists using the language that's going to spur us into action to get these things solved. So that's why we exist and why we do our work as a national charity. And we'd certainly like to hear those warnings as we go into the discussion in a minute. And before that, we can't welcome Dr. Jane O'Sullivan, as she is actually sleeping currently in Australia. So, but we have got a recording from her, and so I'll do an introduction for her and then try and play the recording. So, Dr. Jane O'Sullivan is an honorary senior research fellow at the University of Queensland. She researches the environmental and economic aspects of demographic change, challenging the many myths that are used to dismiss concerns about population growth. In particular, she researches the environmental, social, and economic impacts of population growth and the efficacy of policy and program options addressing it. Right, now bear with me. I am now going to try and share my screen to play her video. All right. Okay. Now, can everybody see that? Great. I'll make sure I have on share sound. Yes, you should be able to hear it too. Okay.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for inviting me to share World Population Day with you. Just bear with me while I share my screen. Okay, so World Population Day is the day when the United Nations reaffirms the importance of women's reproductive rights and how gender equity is the key to sustainability. These are great sentiments, but what you won't hear them say is that population growth is a problem. They won't tell you that global fertility rate barely fell at all in the last decade. They're more likely to stress the assumed problems of an ageing population than to warn that the failure to increase family planning efforts will lock whole regions into increasing destitution and escalate all of our environmental crises. This is the nature of the population taboo. But how did we get here? back in the 1950s, people had the foresight to see that rapid population growth in underdeveloped countries would cause increasing hardship. By the 1970s, modern contraceptives were cheap and effective, and a number of countries had family planning programs to get the birth rate down. By the 1980s, some lessons have been learned about how not to do it, including the coercive measures that were used briefly in India and aggressively in China under the one-child policy. But at the same time, developing countries had seen the successes and were more convinced than ever of the importance of reducing population growth. But already the Catholic campaigners had been at work in the USA and had shifted the Reagan government's position to one of regarding population growth as a neutral phenomenon. They said, for every extra mouth, God provides a pair of hands, and that humans are the ultimate resource. And so was born the revisionist thesis on population and development, discrediting earlier motivations for voluntary family planning as a vital part of development strategies. Then we get to the 1994 International Conference on Population and Development held in Cairo, and its now famous shifting of the paradigm away from so-called demographic goals to focused almost exclusively on women's reproductive health and rights. The family planning practitioners at Cairo welcomed the foregrounding of women's health and empowerment. They had always pushed for client-focused services and against coercion. But inexplicably, the women's health movement came to the view that demographic goals were their enemy, rebranded as neo-Malthusianism and population control, rather than seeing them as useful motivator for politicians to support women's rights and empowerment. This anti-Malthusian sentiment ambushed many family planning practitioners who'd seen themselves as champions of women's rights, but suddenly found themselves labelled the population mafia. And so we now have a paradigm built on myths and non sequiturs. The first non sequitur is that demographic goals, such as any explicit preference for smaller families or less population growth, inherently invoke coercive measures like forced abortions and sterilizations. Let's not forget that this myth was largely engineered by the Holy See, an institution that is deeply misogynist and has a policy of coercive childbearing. This quote on this slide is the entire treatment of population growth in the UN's 2014 review of the Cairo Programme of Action. It's a 235-page report, and population is relegated to a disparaging footnote. It begins by rewriting history, claiming that overpopulation concern was politicised in ironic contrast to the denialism that they have politicised, and that it directly resulted in population control without heed to people's reproductive aspirations, their health, or the health of their children. An appalling misrepresentation of programs that were fundamentally humanitarian and about the health of women and children. It goes on to assert the claim that pursuing general development and rights for women will lead to lower population growth than targeted efforts for birth control, which is to say that family planning promotion was always unnecessary, ineffective, and inappropriate. Another gross misrepresentation. But they have the temerity to claim that this report assembles evidence confirming this assertion when it made not even the vaguest attempt to test it. There's been a growing body of literature supporting the opposite conclusion, that by discrediting population stabilisation as a motive for delivering family planning services, funding plummeted, and not only has there been more population growth, but more women lack access to birth control, leading to more unwanted pregnancies, more maternal and infant deaths, less economic freedom and education access for women, less poverty reduction and food security than there would otherwise have been. As the family planning veteran Malcolm Potts said, the ultimate tragedy is that the idealism at Cairo has actually left women worse off. But the UN refuses to countenance any failure of the Cairo agenda. In the few minutes I have left, I want to present some data to press 2 points that I think are vital for reasserting the moral imperative for rapid population stabilisation. the environmental imperative should trump everything, but it doesn't get a look in against these two prevailing myths. My first claim is that voluntary family planning programs were the most effective interventions ever implemented for promoting economic development and empowerment of women. I want to dispel the myth that the pre-Cairo national family planning programs, the sort that actually promoted the very real benefits of small families, were unnecessary, ineffective and inappropriate, and that fertility decline is best driven by girls' education and reducing poverty. The chart here shows that many countries had rapid fertility declines, and they were all countries that implemented strong family planning efforts. The decline starts very abruptly, marking the start of their family planning program. Even for China, most of the decline happened under a voluntary program started around 1970, well before the one-child policy came in 1979. These transitions had little to do with girls' education or economic advancement. There's no case of rapid fertility decline that was not due to national family planning programs. In the next charts, all developing countries are grouped according to how fast birth rates fell. The countries in the green group all had strong voluntary family planning programs, and birth rates fell very fast. And after about 40 years, their population growth is coming to an end. All these countries are powering ahead in terms of development, but the development came after the fertility decline, not before. In contrast, the red group, most of which still have more than 4 children per woman, have on average gone nowhere economically. And this is understandable when we realise that population growth diverts a lot of investment and effort just to build enough infrastructure and provide enough teachers and doctors and everything else to expand everything at a rate of 2 or 3% per year in order not to go backwards. Most poor countries simply can't keep up. It's like trying to run up a down escalator. Escalator's too fast, you end up going backwards. But if you can just slow it down a bit, you start to make headway. The slower it goes, the more benefit you get for the same amount of effort. So it's not just about whether a country is overpopulated, even if it still has a lot of natural resources. Its growth rate is a big drag on progress. Our second myth is that population ageing will cause economic calamity if we don't boost the population growth to dilute the elderly with ever bigger cohorts of young people. This is a beat-up serving the interests of the growth industry and based on transparently nonsensical modelling assumptions. It's just nonsense to assume that the economy is governed by the supply of job seekers rather than by the demand for their labour. But that's exactly what all the modelling assumes. If we look at what actually happened across OECD countries, some of which have aged much more than others, there is no trend at all between the extent of ageing and the proportion of people who have employment, nor between the extent of ageing and health spending. These charts show this lack of relationship. In contrast, both the bottom charts have significant trends, and what has happened is exactly what market theory predicts. A tightening labour market means less unemployment and better conditions for workers, leading to lower inequality. In countries like Australia that have pushed up population growth to counter the effects of ageing, youth underemployment and housing unaffordability are extremely high, and the cost of vast amounts of new infrastructure has blown out government debt. It's a case of the cure being much worse than the disease. But the danger of this ageing myth is that even leaders of high fertility countries are believing it and are reluctant to reduce birth rates too fast. Some of them think that their young age structure will be an economic boon, ensuring their success while Europe grows old and senesces. Some of them are taking away women's access to contraception to boost the birth rate. This is disastrous for our prospects for peace and sustainability. But where is the UN in all this? It's largely egging on the ageing myths. So I'll finish on that sceptical note, but invite you to please visit the Overpopulation Project, where I have the privilege of working with my colleagues Frank Gottmark and Phil Cafaro to provide a platform for disseminating good science about population and the benefits of reducing population. you can sign up there for our weekly blog post, and we're always open to suggestions of ideas for the blog. So happy World Population Day, and I wish you all the best for the rest of the forum. I wish I could be there in person, but it's a pleasure to have had a chance to speak to you.
Right. Okay, thank you very much, Jane. And I did note at the end she was saying happy Population Day and had a wry smile. I've been finding it a bit difficult to smile while we're going through this topic, actually. So it seems to be a topic where we should be fairly serious and be heeding the warnings. Right, now comes the point that to some extent we've all been waiting for, is we're going to put our three eminent speakers on the spot. We're going to ask them if they can possibly reach an agreement between them, which would be great. No problems if we can't. And if the speakers are happy, you're welcome to all three of you to unmute, although I will ask Bill to start, Phoebe second, Chris third. But if there was something that you wanted to just interject while somebody's talking, if it's possible to do it without us getting out of control, that's great, because we'd like to sort of have a debate. So, okay, great. If I could just then, I think we've sort of do it in 3 bits. So if we start with simply looking at what we think a scientifically defensible, sustainable world population figure would be, and then we'll move on to the whys and wherefores afterwards. So Bill, over to you first.
Well, this is a hugely important question, and there are so many variables that fit into it. It's difficult to make any kind of definitive answer. It depends on, for example, what is a desirable standard of living? Obviously, if you have twice as many people living at carrying capacity, you'll have half the standard of living you will have if you have half as many people. So the ultimate population is a factor of the productivity of the planet, combined with a desirable standard of living. So Christopher, I think, has come up with a reasonable number, assuming a certain material standard. I think we're headed for fewer than 3 billion, something like 1 to 2 billion, because we've degraded the carrying capacity of the planet so much. People forget that we're not starting here with a fresh planet Earth. We're seeing baseline drift. So if you just look at the rate at which human competitive displacement of non-human life has taken place, it gives you an indicator of how far we've come here. 10,000 years ago, human beings accounted for less than 1% of the biomass, the weight of mammals on planet Earth. Today, we are about 32% of a much larger biomass, but our domestic animals account for another 64% or thereabouts. So wild nature is now displaced to somewhere between 2 and 5% of the total biomass of mammals. Humans and their domestic animals account for the other 96% or so, plus or minus. There's several studies that dispute what the margins look like here. But the fact is that human beings have become the dominant species on the planet. And yet, to go to a point I think that Jane made over and over again, we are run by mythology. So today, a dominant myth is that there's no conflict between the growth of the human enterprise and the maintenance of environmental quality. Every major politician I've ever listened to on this question has asserted that point. And it's absolute nonsense. Another myth, the human economy, as technology advances, is decoupling from the environment. This is absolute and utter nonsense if you look at actual energy and material flows. So we have this complete disconnect between what the data are showing us and what rational analysis says we should do, and what we are doing out of constructed myths that have no basis in reality. So I can't underscore more how false it is to think that we have reason at foot here. Human beings are not primarily a rational species. We are primarily a species that goes according to myths, and those myths incorporate that which we would like to be, not that which is. And that's the situation we are in today. So just to get back to my main point, we've so degraded the biocapacity of the Earth that whereas we might have supported 3 billion people in 1970, I doubt very much that we could do so today at any kind of material standard that people would come to appreciating. We have to get out of the notion of acting out of our myths and start paying attention to the real data. And that is the single greatest barrier, it seems to me, confronting us. that we are incapable of acting on the evidence because it confounds or frustrates achieving that which we wish were the case.
Thank you, Bill. Well, Phoebe, so starting from Bill's main supposition that it's 1 to 2 billion, would you like to now follow and comment on that?
I'm comfortable with starting at 3 and adapting. We do need goals. They're very helpful for quantifying and, you know, setting public policy as well as personal decisions. I'm not so much concerned about the precise goal as the fact that we take a decision to move there. A lot of what Bill says about standard of living is very important. Now, I grew up, like many of us, with frugal parents, and there's nothing more important than the West bearing in mind the need to move to a mindset of sufficiency. You know, living in Southern Africa, where most people are comfortable with sufficiency, back to the US, where I was born and raised, where not only personal mindsets of entitlement and consumption and convenience and status and accumulation of stuff are overwhelming in many people, certainly not everybody, but also the systems set up to deliver resources. I moved into a house where it's really hard to open the tap a little bit. I, you know, having lived in the driest country south of the Sahara, Namibia, for 14 years, I find it galling the way society is often constructed to waste. So we've got to move from our wasteful mindsets in the rich northern countries towards a mindset, but also the social and logistical structures for sufficiency. I think I will leave it there for now.
Okay, great, Phoebe. Coming to you, Chris, but I just like also seeing somebody's comment as well. We started today because from scientists' warnings, we should have a scientifically definable sustainable population goal. So that's what we're looking for. In addition, just from my experience of a lot of the work on climate, biodiversity, etc., is that without focus on a specific goal, it's very difficult to create plans to get there. And that you sort of need to have a goal, even if the goal is revised at some point in the future as being wrong or can be corrected because you have new information, you need a goal in order to start the steps. And that if all you do is start walking towards a goal that you haven't defined, I don't tend to see that as working terribly well as a policy. But anyway, my opinion, Chris, over to you. You're much more of an expert than me. So 1 to 2 billion from Bill. Phoebe, starting with 3 billion, but coming back to maybe action towards the goal is the first thing we should be doing. Where are you on this?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like we're all members of the same club. You know, we have kind of, you know, different opinions on various pieces. You know, once somebody agrees that 7.9 billion is unsustainable, that we exceeded our Earth's carrying capacity and we need to bring it down, you're all members of the same club at that point, right? Then it is, how do you bring the population curve, you know, downward? Where you stop, I think, then becomes a reasonable discussion, but it's actually a discussion that we would have several decades to work through. You know, that's one reason why, you know, I've got this chapter that I entitled Reimagining Economics for an Era of Degrowth. Many degrowth economists will say we must degrow. And I just say, well, you're gonna, when the population curve bends, and it's either gonna bend, as Bill said, it's either gonna be a precipitous collapse, or it's gonna be a manageable curve. So how do you bring in a manageable curve? Because nobody wants a precipitous collapse that averts like the awful peak. Personally, 9 billion just from 9 billion makes me very nervous. I think the climate community has done a good job of pointing out, you know, the higher the temperature gets, the higher the probability of disasters, the greater the magnitude those disasters will be, the higher the frequency they will be. And that's not just a climate thing. That's for all of these ecological disasters, right? I think 9 billion puts us in very treacherous territory. So when IMHE wrote in Lancet, we'll hit 9.7 billion in 2064 and the curve will go down, that gave me no comfort at all. So I think there's a community out there that says, hey, it'll all be good. It's going to go down eventually. And they just haven't asked the question, how many people can they support, which we're here today. So, I mean, the 1 to 2 billion number, if anything, the only fights I've really had, not fights, but, with folks over my book and my estimates has been on the low side, not on the high side. Nobody's really come in and said, I really think we're going to be fine at 8, 9, 10, or 11. I have had a couple of people say, my number was 4.5 to 5, but you really made me reconsider it. I'm gonna start thinking that lower might be needed. But on the lower end, I think people have really, really good arguments for which they have really, really good data. My argument is twofold. One is I am a technological optimist. And I believe just as in kind of the post-World War II era, the nature of capitalism, industrial capitalism shifted, our production function, if you will, shifted, and we started using much more noxious, our use of endocrine disruptors, just exploded. And that was not a thing that really, went on at the same scale beforehand. We can talk about DDT story, for which a Nobel Prize was awarded to a doctor, I just want to point out. But, so that production function has shifted. It's probably shifted again. The 70s were not kind to the world. But the same way, I believe that production function can actually shift in a way that uses resources better. How you achieve that shift through regulatory or by spurring particular kinds of innovation. I'm a bit of a Schumpeterian when it comes to economics, so I'm big on kind of creative destruction. How do you channel that creative destruction in the economy in a way that leads to more, helpful production functions while bringing the population down? The second point I'd make is we have the opportunity to rewild and protect and unburden our planet even while the population's going up. I mean, we've grown our exclusion, maritime protected areas just in recent years. It's tough, and keeping, rapacious fishing fleets from incurring on those zones is hard. But there are things we can do even as the population grows. And I would like to think that we could bend the population curve in a manageable way soon after 2100, depending on how soon, let's say 2120, get somewhere around 3 billion, maybe it's 4 billion. And the entire time we could have spent the century actually unburdening many noxious, things we have foisted onto our planet. So.
Right, great. Thanks, Chris. You sort of went a bit on to our next question.
Sorry about that.
Fine. So you sort of jumped the gun and got started on it. In terms of targets, I think we're sort of, if I compare this to the UN's target on net zero emissions of being 2050 as the absolute endpoint of when the planet needs to get to net zero, as perhaps being our 3 billion figure in comparison on population. Whereas scientists warning Europe and many scientific bodies around the world are saying 2030 is the target we need to go to on net zero. And the 2050 target is present on a 66% chance of staying under 1.5 degrees. And the 2030 target is on the basis that we have a very, very good chance of staying under 1.5 degrees. But as Phoebe and you've just said, as we moved on to sort of the next session, is first thing is to get started on the target. And the UN had told us 2 years ago we needed 7.6% reduction every year, which we haven't done. And we're still going up at about 1% a year. So the target gets more and more difficult. In fact, both targets. So just with that then, as the bit of background, we'll move back into the same order, although in a sense, because Chris has moved ahead on the question, so we could take some of his comments in if you like. And just to say, we had said that we were going to be finishing at 6:30, but that we would extend if people would like to stay for another half an hour if these three thorny questions hadn't been answered and we'd aired them properly. So we will continue. Our speakers are happy to do that. So anybody is welcome to stay, of course, for the next half hour. So Bill, we're talking about 3 billion is our 2050 target in a sense, comparative to climate emissions, and our 2030 target is your 1 billion. Let's assume we're on our path to get to them. What should we be doing to get there? And when should we be aiming to get there?
Okay, I have to, before even getting into that question, I've got to go back. And certainly Christopher's a much more technologically optimistic person than I am. So let me just make a couple of points that reframes this question. There is no possibility that we will retain global warming below 1.5 degrees right now. Already in the pipe due to slow positive, rather rapid positive feedbacks, even if carbon emissions were stabilized so that the atmospheric concentration did not increase further, we would see somewhere between 0.6 and 1 degree additional warming beyond and above that which we have right now. So let me say again, there is no chance of remaining within a 1.5 degree global warming. And at current rates, we will probably surpass 2 degrees of mean global warming, certainly by 2050. And we're on track actually for 3 to 4 degrees. So let's get real about those kinds of numbers. Secondly, none of these so-called solutions being entertained within the mainstream community are going to change any of that, because the major permissive or permitted technological advances, and Chris may disagree with me here, such as wind, solar, non-existent carbon capture technologies, electric vehicles, all of these things require massive capital investment. They're all constructed using fossil fuels. They're not renewable. They are merely replaceable. Wind towers last in practice about 15 to 20 years tops and have to be replaced on solar panels, perhaps 20 to 25 years. So these are technologies that are not going to replace fossil fuels. So we are going to see, no matter which way we go, a much energy poorer world than we have now. And we are not going to be able to produce the resources, including the food necessary to sustain 9 billion people, perhaps not even our present population into 2050. So we're in a much more dire situation than anyone is really fully aware of in the international. You see, we think in very narrow reductionist terms. That's how our brains evolve. But we live in a very complex system. Let's just take another trend we've talked about. You saw that graph of the growth of global cities. Cities are made of concrete. Concrete is a huge emitter of carbon dioxide. Just building out the cities to accommodate the anticipated population by 2030 would use the entire global carbon budget. And by the way, some scientists now argue there is no remaining carbon budget if you want to retain mean global warming to within 2 degrees Celsius. I should also point out the insanity of the economic models. I said earlier that we believe we're decoupling from nature. Human beings are the single largest component of every major ecosystem on planet Earth, at least any to which we have access. Listen to me carefully. We are the single greatest herbivore and carnivorous animal ever to walk the earth. That is truth. We can demonstrate it clearly. And yet we are carrying this myth in our minds that we're capable of decoupling from nature and therefore continuing to grow through technology while reducing our total impact. So I simply don't agree that that's possible. Every additional human being, for the simple reasons of the first and second laws of thermodynamics, uses some resources and some energy, takes up some space. And that means there is less resources, energy, and space available for other species on planet Earth. And that's the situation we are in. Now, I don't even remember what your question was, but I think it's a much more complex context for the question than we've been discussing so far.
It was fantastic. Thank you for that. And we straying onto the whole of the climate issue is needed and required. So thank you. Now, what we're trying to come to on the question was, if we're accepting it's a 1.3 to 3 billion, not just accepting, we are all believing that that is the right one, then how are we going to get there? What's our strategy for getting there? And really, when should we do it? Because we don't get there till 2200. It's clearly too late.
Oh, obviously. Well, I think Jane presented some very compelling data. I think I've believed in it for some time, that we need to have voluntary access to the best possible family planning methods. People will take advantage of it. If you combine that with education and economic security for women, we would be well on our way. There's another variable here we haven't discussed. This may be a non-issue if male sperm counts continue to decline at the rate the current data are suggesting. Some say that sperm counts will be down to virtually zero by mid-century, in which case we may have massive reproductive failure on the part of the human species. So again, this is an incredibly complex situation. And that problem results exactly from one of the things Christopher was talking about, the release of hormone mimicking compounds into the environment as a result of agriculture and various chemical processes. So there are so many parallel lines going here that the human mind is incapable of wrapping itself around any one of these complex issues, let alone the whole. But we have to keep them in mind before moving forward. So my answer is give everybody that we possibly can opportunities for family planning, for birth control, and increase economic security for women. And we can do that while still shrinking the whole. By the way, I mean, a huge barrier here we haven't discussed at all is the power dynamics. Most of our governments are in the thrall of the major corporate sector actors who have no interest whatsoever in anything that we're talking about here, whose entire existence depends on the capitalist motivation of growing the economy. And as long as our governments pay more attention to those interests and to the interests of the population at whole, to the interests of the planet, then nothing can happen. So we are doubly bound once again in power dynamics, in complete ignorance of the actual situation because we're acting out of our myths, and the foolish belief that this is going to resolve itself through rational analysis of one kind or another. Most of us here are rational people, and we think this is what we should do. But there's a huge gulf between knowing what should be done and knowing how to get it to happen in a population that's scientifically ignorant, politicians who are not only ignorant, but often in deep denial and in the pockets of the corporate sector. This is a hugely complex socio-dynamic problem, quite apart from the ecological and climate circumstances that it has led to.
Yep.
Thank you, Bill. And sorry, go ahead, Phoebe.
Well, I think we'll be lucky to have the luxury of being able to achieve nice, smooth policy goals, but none of us want war and pandemics and electromagnetic pulses and chaos in cities to take these decisions for us. As someone who's worked, most of my career in national development planning and, doing collaborative strategic action plans for various topics from biodiversity to climate change. And, I've developed a government style interest in how we get there from here and how we schedule different actions. My very wise husband is always saying, you can't fix a car while it's driving. We can fix a lot of the things about this planet while we're driving, but ultimately the global economic engine is hard to stop and pull over in a pit stop and tinker with it and get back on track. I think many of us, especially those who have lived as I have in Sweden and other social democracies, understand that there's not just a binary system of economic systems to choose from, but I'm starting to have to make my peace with kind of tinkering with capitalism as it goes along, because much of the world has now adopted it. How do we do that in a way that works as fast as is needed for the planet, for the climate, and for social justice? It's a big task. And that's why, as I said to you the other day, Ed, we need people who are really adept at scheduling changes. So all of these things can happen simultaneously without having to park the economy to one side while we figure it out.
Oh, sorry, great. Thanks, Phoebe. Chris, we're coming down to our last 20 minutes. Would love to have you coming in on this with a couple of extra comments and things, so please do. And then we'll try and get on to our other major question before we try and address something else at the end. Over to you.
Yeah, no, I feel like I agree with everything I just heard. My call is for a TFR of 1.5 by 2030. That means before 2030, we need to stop adding people to the planet every year. Right now, we add 80 million people to the planet every year the equivalent of 10 New York cities every single year. That doesn't work. People cry, you know, in newspaper articles about Japan and how they're losing people. Japan's doing pretty darn well as a country. The fact that it lost 500,000 people over the past couple of years, you know, doesn't seem to be, they're not folding up shop and throwing their hands in the air and walking away from life. It turns out that we can put together a policy mix that can deal with a, you know, permanent degrowth, and we can manage to have personal prosperity and well-being, even though we're having a long-term decrease in the number of people that we have and a downsizing in the size of our economy. GDP is perhaps the absolute worst measure that anyone ever came up with ever. And, you know, even, you know, economists like Joe Stiglitz, right, you know, are writing books about how GDP is a bad measure. So when you read something in the newspaper that is just another journalist who took another bad undergraduate macroeconomics course and, you know, regurgitating it as like worldly, thoughtful, you know, discourse, it's not. You know, what we need to do is target in my opinion, target 1.5 by 2030 and be decreasing the numbers every year from then on. And I believe there are viable strategies through investing in empowering, you know, ethical, just, and empowering strategies toward women and girls. And I don't mean like a little bit. I mean like put as much money into that as you're willing to put into a major weapons system at the DoD, right? If we put the equivalent of the Joint Strike Fighter budget up against this, forget about the Manhattan Project, right? Something even lower than the Manhattan Project. You'd be shocked at what the outcomes would be. But, you know, we're not having those discussions because nobody set a target with a date. And I think 2030 is the date, and it gets you somewhere meaningful by 2100.
Thank you, Chris. And certainly, I'm just coming, Bill.
One question. I want Chris to tell me if he knows a single politician anywhere who's had the kind of conversation that we're having here. I mean, who among them would be willing to set those targets and say so publicly that we have made as a planet a gross error in subscribing wholeheartedly to the infinite growth paradigm? And by the way, it's not just capitalism, it's communism and all the rest of it.
Sure.
We have made a gross error. It is time to turn around. Here is what we must do. And we'll pick on Chris's population target. We'll pick, how would that play in the global, in the US political system right now? What presidential candidate would dare stand up and say such things?
Yeah, I think it plays about as well as saying we must avert 1.5C. You know, by doing what? And that's a discussion that has not even recognized that population is driving 1.5C. So, I mean, I feel like that call, frankly, has been this weird disembodied call about parts per million as something that's invisible in the air that the average American, frankly, has no clue what the scientific community is talking about. If you say, hey, you know, if we could get down to on average 1 to 2 kids per woman instead of on average 2 to 3 globally, then we might actually be able to avert bad news in the newspaper every damn day. And, you know, I feel like that's where the scientific community has utterly failed in scientific communication, if you will. You need to make it tractable, and, you know, procreation is the most tractable and, you know, the thing that you have the most control over. The fact that, you know, I think as you pointed out, right, I mean, I'm using my words, but we got a people problem, not a climate problem. All those things are, you know, symptoms of this larger thing, and we're not talking about that thing. So I think we have an opportunity as scientific community to finally put that front and center, not just part of a list. Yes, population income consumption are part of a complex algebra, but you can't like separate the two variables. And then have that as the adult conversation where investment in empowering strategies toward women and girls aggressively, unbelievably aggressively over the next coming decades is something that I think should be rather palatable to many, except for all the people that, you know, don't want to empower women and girls, and those people exist.
Most of the political coterie that are running the world would disallow everything you've just said. So
right, but yet America without immigration is below replacement value. Japan is below replacement value. Thailand is below replacement value. Many delightful places are below replacement value. And I think this is part of communication.
But many countries like that, including Canada, are desperately trying to recruit immigrants so that we can maintain and grow our population in the face of falling fertility rates. So
absolutely.
You're
Okay.
going to get your immigrants into Canada anyway, whether you like it or not. And this is the challenge. You know, I do think we can change this narrative globally and nationally and at local level, and start to look at climate migration as an opportunity for those communities and governments that are willing to accept reality and embrace it and integrate migrants into their communities. The alternative is not good, and we don't want to go there. But we've got to look at that as a powerful reason not to encourage people to reproduce. 25 years ago, probably, when I was in Namibia at the cusp of its independence, the founding president, Sam Nujoma, came and said, people, I've come back here from exile in Europe and I see that there are no trees left. What have you done? And the very next year he said, people, you've got to breed. And then everyone put up their hands in horror and said, but this is a dry country. We don't have the water. And to his credit, he said, right, we need to work smarter, not breed more.
I just, before we finish this, this conversation, partly through some of the questions and observations that were in the chat earlier on, actually, in our period, people were talking about the difference between having a child, of course, in the West, in the overdeveloped countries, and having a child in the developing or underdeveloped countries. And Bill's statement about it has to be family planning, economic access, and education for women, which everybody agrees with. Everybody agrees with that, I think, here who's been talking and has underlined it. But for those that were asking the questions earlier, you could pull out that that could be directed at those in the developing and underdeveloped countries, rather than at those in the West. And we know that every child born in the West is a vast effect on the planet. Just to take the UK example, is a child born here is 12 tons of carbon dioxide every year, which is wildly different to a child born in Nigeria at half a ton currently. So can we just ask you to draw out how the reduction in population could be played out, let's say, in the overdeveloped countries? Bill, would you like to go first?
Oh, I think I did try to underscore that egregious inequality is a huge problem here. And if you really, if you were God and said, okay, let's deal with this through population control, and then reducing the populations of the first world by 20% would have a massive effect beyond any similar number of reductions in the developing world. So this has to be an across the board situation. We have to recognize that the first world is vastly overpopulated, particularly if it hopes to retain anything like the kind of material standards that we currently enjoy. But that does not relieve the responsibility off the shoulders of developing countries. The only way the Earth could support the present population in developing countries is if they remain poor. Because if they all reach the material standard of even middle income countries, you'll need 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 planets that aren't currently available in the marketplace. So this is not a problem that settles only here or there. It's a problem all of us must confront, recognizing that there's another element to this, that if we're going to get serious about retaining a population at around 1 billion, it has to be a much more equitable population. Income distribution, access to resources, and the planetary abundance must be much more fairly shared across the board. So in addition to population strategies, we need economic strategies that, for example, outlaw income disparity no more than 5. So that the chief CEO of a corporation can't earn more than 5 times the income of the average shop floor worker, which, by the way, is about the average differential between the upper and lower pay levels within the Spanish co-ops, the non-urban cooperatives. In the United States, that differential may be as much as 200 or 300 or 400. So that's a huge thing that we have to deal with. The inequity that is built into the kind of system that we have today. So yes, let's do what we must to reduce population, but recognize that the material underpinning to the planet also has to be more fairly distributed among the population, whatever it might be that remains. By the way, we could not sustain, overshoot means that we could not sustain the present world population even at average material standards. If everyone today were utterly equal in economic terms, we'd still have to reduce the total consumption by about 50%.
Yeah.
Yes, Phoebe.
I'll pass. I'm busy answering questions in the chat. So
Well, and I think Phoebe is always the most delightful voice to end a conversation anyway. So, you know, what I just want to underscore everything Bill just said. I mean, it's 100% right. What I really liked about Bill's charts is he didn't break it into developed world and developing world, right? He had 4 different categories to show, you know, what the actual numbers are kind of broken out in those segments. And I think that's critical to understand. Because everybody kind of wants to make it, you know, pit 2 sides against each other and turn it into a non-productive conversation. And I think the data shows that doesn't need to be the case. The other kind of dynamic piece to it, I'd love it to see Bill's charts kind of projected out into the future dynamically so we could watch it all play out. You know, a lot of the statistics out there is that, you know, we're talking about a couple billion people from, you know, the poor moving into the global middle class just over the next decade. And right, so those 4 categories Bill broke out, like you're going to see big shifts, you know, from one category into a completely different category in parts of the world that right now we say, oh, you know, we shouldn't tell them, they don't consume that much. You know, one of my favorite books is a social scientist, Kishore Mahbubani, wrote a book called The New Asian Hemisphere. And he talked about like growing up in the slums, you know, in South Asia. And, you know, all they watched TV and saw these great things everybody wanted. And that program, everybody, they wanted those things. So you have to think about the large cohorts of people that are going to move from, you know, a lower station in life to a much higher station in life, just in one lifetime, just in one decade. And that's going to have a crushing effect on our planet between now and 2030, in my opinion. So if we don't begin having fewer people on the planet every year after 2030, I don't see exactly how you make the math work out here.
Right, great. Well, I should stop myself saying great all the time, because I'm actually meaning great and wonderful speaking by you all, not great that we've solved the problem suddenly and it's all going to get better. Right, we're running down to the last 9 minutes of our extended period. And we did set another question which we'd really like to answer. And I think of Jane O'Sullivan's correct criticism of the United Nations. But let's see if we can give them a solution. Well, one of the things the United Nations has is the Sustainable Development Goals. There isn't one that, I mean, they can be applied to, in a sense, some things in population, but there isn't one that specifically addresses population. So should the United Nations have an SDG that reflects population or addresses population? And if it should, what do you think it should be? So Bill Rees again.
Well, it absolutely should. And I have to comment on the existing Sustainable Development Goals. Most of them assume, and in fact are dependent on, the maintenance of at least the current global economic system and its growth. So here we have Sustainable Development Goals that are essentially in support of the very system that has created the need for the Sustainable Development Goals in the first place. So I find this, again, a result of our completely illogical approach to the major problems facing us. Science plays almost no role here. It's political correctness. It's a variety of other special interests influencing the policy decisions. Jane described very clearly how the United Nations perspective on these issues has been distorted by outside pressure. The IPCC is exactly the same, grossly underestimating the pace and dimensions of climate change because of hugely powerful political interests intervening in those discussions. So as long as we're in those kinds of circumstances, Chris is absolutely right. We're in a situation where we must do A, B, and C by 2030, and there's almost no chance of it happening from within the current dynamic that we're talking about here. What was your question again? Sorry.
You've answered around it in terms of the methodology. Should there be a Sustainable Development Goal? You've told us, right? What should it be? Have we got a suggestion for the UN?
Well, it's what we've been talking about all along here. Let's set a target. Let's make it reasonable. Let's base it on science. Let's say it's somewhere between Chris's 3 and my bottom line of 1 billion. And what must we do to get there? What are the best ways, short of a sterilization of the population, for moving in that direction? And the science is fairly clear on that. Everybody, you said it yourself, or someone did. We all know what should happen, what should be being done. It's just not being done. and are huge prohibitions to it happening, from the Catholic Church to the government of the United States, which prevent these kinds of things from taking effect in the world.
Ed, this is one of the thorniest issues that we probably have to face, and yet we are just about out of time. We cannot afford the luxury of bickering, finger pointing between consumption and population, or indeed organizations competing for attention, visibility, resourcing in the public space. This is the time where we need to build, if I can use this term, a broad church of organizations, people at multiple scales. Everyone needs to be able to move to the point of talking about this in a transformative way with governments and policymakers. And this is a steep hill to climb. So how can we do this, given that most people, as Bill confirms, are used to speaking very much from their own small self-interested mindset? We have to focus on the system effects that we need to basically entreat others to become cognizant of. And I don't know how we're going to do it, but we have started, and we've got to shame people that are finger pointing, bickering, and finding a million ways not to do it. We're out of time.
Chris, over to you. And could you come and tell us, so what are we going to tell the UN?
I would focus on the slope of the curve, not the absolute number. I think if we get the slope negative, we have a long time to actually figure out that number. We need to emphasize that we long ago exceeded our risk carrying capacity. We've accumulated ecological debt, and that has to end. I would say 1.5 TFR by 2050. It doesn't mean no one ever has children anymore. It doesn't mean no one has any grandchildren anymore. It means on average 1 to 2 children instead of 2 to 3 globally. Then that forces a lot of tough adult conversations amongst world leaders that are deeply uncomfortable. And they're about as deeply uncomfortable as telling everybody that everybody's going to cook in their own air and water in the next few decades. So I say have the 18th SDG be 1.5 TFR by 2030. If somebody wants to bicker on the math, I'm happy to have the conversation offline. And possibly even, as Rob Harding wrote once, a few years ago, calling for a United Nations Framework Convention on Population Growth. There's many moving pieces. You need a framework to think about it. It's investment in women and girls. It's investment in family planning technologies. It's a lot of different things, not one thing. So have a framework for it. Have real adult conversations about it, and don't let UNFPA and UNEP and all these different UN organizations just kind of put their head in the ground and ignore it, because there's nothing sustainable about the SDGs until we deal with climate.
Great.
Until we deal with population. Sorry.
Thank you very, very much, Chris. That's great. Thank you to all of our speakers. I'm going to start drawing it to a close now, as we're about 2 minutes from our extended period. It's an extraordinarily difficult subject, which is so obvious. And once you've actually, you wouldn't have, many of the people here wouldn't have had to hear the speakers talking to know we are too many people on the planet and we need to address it. So it's an obvious one. I have to confess on my own journey, firstly, to being a Catholic, which means that my start of the journey really was the brush with the scientist warnings, and then coming to the point of saying, well, being a Catholic or not, if the GP told me that I was sick in a particular way and I had to take action, my GP, my doctor, I'd get on and take action. And so I looked at the scientist warnings and said, well, that's the scientist telling me that I've got to take action, so I am. And to some extent, the Pope accepts that in the writings that he does on a lot of these. He's supportive of what the scientists have been saying. The other thing I'd like to just confess actually is, because Bill said, what politician in the world would take up the call and actually work on any of these policies at all? And I suppose I should confess an interest as having just become a little politician, but effectively a unitary councillor, so at the highest level of local politics in the UK, I suppose a state politics if it was in the US or whatever. And I actually got elected on the only policy of climate action now. That was the only policy. And as far as I know, from anywhere I've ever spoken to anybody. I'm the only politician ever to have been elected with a single policy of climate action, but it shows a change in the electorate and in their appetite for doing things. So firstly, Bill, I'll put my hand up and say I'm one, so I will be saying it, but also that the electorate are now ready for people who will be saying these things. And although population may appear to be fractionally more difficult to talk about than the climate at the moment, it comes hand in hand. So, and I'd leave then by urging everybody here, as well as thanking you for being here, I would urge you not to be in the congregation of the converted who turn up to church already converted, hear from the very distinguished preachers who then tell you all the things that to some extent you already knew, but explain it to you in more detail, and then go away and don't do anything on it. We have got to go out and take action on it. And it's a vast number of conversations that we need to do, and they can start locally in our church, in our parish, etc. And we can drive this forward. We have to go out of these meetings, taking the warnings on board and starting to take action, not just being a big group of the converted who are all together agreeing with each other. So please take it out and talk to people about it, because it is a difficult conversation. And as a Catholic 2 years ago, it was tough for me to get started on it. But with the scientists' warnings, with the scientific background, I addressed it, and I haven't found people picking me up on it, even in church. They have in general agreed with it, and that's the way we can drive the action. So thank you again very much to our speakers. So thank you, Bill, thank you, Phoebe, thank you, Chris. We are exactly on our extended bit of overtime. Thank you so much for everybody for coming. I'm sorry we couldn't get through the exact questions, but we did draw out some themes, hopefully, into it that the speakers then spoke at. And please, go out and have a, rather than a happy, but a successful population day in which we move this conversation forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ed.
Wonderful to meet you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.